Hey there. Welcome to today's Mobile Response and Stabilization Learning Community as we talk through what I think is a really important conversation that most of the country is having around workforce. But today's conversation about workforce, I think, is a little bit different because as we talk about mobile response and stabilization, and as for folks who have been joining us know, mobile response and stabilization is a little bit different, and the workforce is going to need a little bit of special attention. So even though we're having some challenges, it's really important for us to begin to have this conversation. So anyway, welcome. My name is Liz Manley, and I am a senior advisor for health and behavioral health policy at the Institute for Innovation and Implementation. And I'm really excited today to be joined first by Hazelyn Pilgrim from the Family Support Organization of Essex County in New Jersey. Hazelyn, you want to say hello?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see so many fine people here today. Looking forward to our conversation.
And our special guest today is Sarah Quinn, who I'm very fortunate to work with at the Institute. So Sarah, you want to say hello?
Hi, good afternoon all, or some of you might not be afternoon, so hey, so good to be here with you.
And today we're going to talk about workforce development. We're going to focus a little bit on some of the work that's happening in Maryland around building the workforce, but a lot of the tools and principles that we're going to talk about are being used in other places as well. It'd be really helpful for all of you if you have some strategies, if you want to share them in the chat, or if you have questions, please pop them in the chat. We're happy to take them at any point during today's conversation. And we like to think of these learning community as a real conversation around what's happening around the country. So let's get started. I've already said hello. And so today, let me just touch real quick on the learning objectives. Really, it's about identifying the skills necessary for a skilled workforce. We know that in order to be impactful, children, youth, families, young adults all require special attentiveness to the skills necessary to engage both parent and caregiver, as well as the young person themselves. And so today's workforce conversation is going to be talking about some of those developmental needs, but also we know that mobile response and stabilization in particular requires some real attentiveness in shifting culture and language in the way that we think about some of this work. Two, we want to develop approaches for coaching for innovation because we really need to think about how we're going to support the workforce, not just in the short term, but in the long term, and continue to learn from our experiences to make sure that we're providing what is really best practice as we move along. And that we're going to establish the criteria for a certification process. That's going to be important as we talk through some of the workforce issues and challenges across states and communities. So I'm not me if I don't talk about language. And in this conversation in particular, it's really important for us to talk about language and that how we think about children, youth, and families is really important. And we need to begin to think about children, youth, and families as true, meaningful partners within the work and really helping to set a level table is the first part of the work within systems organization and systems design. And the way that we do that, the first way that we can do that, at least, and to me, one of the easiest things to do, because this doesn't cost any money, and it doesn't require anyone else to help, is we can shift the way we speak about this work. And so we talk about children, youth, and young adults, not clients, cases, or consumers. That will not be language that you hear me speak about. We talk about parents and caregivers, not mom and dad, clearly not my mom and dad. So we don't put folks into these role-based scenarios. So we really talk about parents and caregivers and use their names whenever possible. It's really important in establishing respectful relationships, with I think Hazelyn will talk a little bit about. We talk about family, not those families, by the way. I think that one's probably a given for folks on this call today. But believe it or not, in some places I do need to reiterate that from time to time. We talk about treatment and treatment interventions and not placement. That's a real important conversation that leads to young people being in higher intensities of service than is necessary in order to meet their medical necessity criteria. So it's really important for us to think about what is the actual treatment intervention that's necessary for the child to do well. We talk about engagement. I don't ever think about young people not being motivated. I think it's their job not to be motivated. And it's my job to figure out how to motivate. So it's really important for us to think about this idea that individuals are not motivated. We really need to think about how engagement is the number one thing that's important within this work. We talk about a transition and not closing or terminating. It's really just too overwhelming for me to think about terminating 13-year-olds. Just seems a little bit too much for us to think about. But the issue of transition is important because in mobile response and stabilization, we're just talking about transition from the beginning, right? It's really this transition process from beginning to end, and how we actually set the stage around transition is really important. But the role of transition within the children's system of care is for the professionals to step out and for the family to continue its work, right? Families continue to support each other over time, and so things don't stop because professionals step out. So we really need to understand what our role is at that table. And then I always like to talk about this real challenge around missing children. Language is really important when it comes to children who are not where we think they should be. If they're not where we think they should be, we should go find them, bring them back, and find out why they were missing in the first place. We talk about children from the perspective of running away or AWOL or they elope, means that they took an active role in that, and people do not go find them, bring them back. There are reasons why young people are not where we think they should be, sometimes because they're doing other things, sometimes because they're upset or need to sort of feel like they need to get out. There's lots of reasons why they do it, why they're not where we think they should be. But when they aren't where we think they should be, adults should go find them, bring them back, find out why they were missing in the first place. And it really changes our practice right from the start. Mm-hmm. So I just always want to just run by the mobile response and stabilization continuum just to make sure that everybody's on board. If it's the first time you're joining us, I just like to make sure that you understand what we're talking about. And so what we're talking about really is, hold on, one click too far. What we're talking about is an understanding that mobile response and stabilization is truly customization specifically for children, that it allows us to have a single point of access in which parents, caregivers can reach out, ask for help, and we send it. And with that, they don't have to jump over a big bar to say they meet medical necessity or criteria, they have a diagnosis, or their behavior is really out of control. What they get to say is, I don't know what to do, and I need assistance. And we send somebody to help figure out what that's about. And it has a couple different components, including the idea that someone responds to the home, that there's a system to support. We've covered a lot of these topics within our other learning communities. I encourage you to go back and take a look at some of them if you're interested. But just in terms of workforce development, we want to today talk about a couple of different things. We're going to talk about the screening and assessment, and the requirements around that. We're going to talk about some of the safety planning and why it's important for staff to be well trained in a lot of that kind of component, and some of the other parts of the mobile response and stabilization continuum. But this is what it looks like in case you have any questions. The goals continue to be the same: support the young person in their own homes, schools, and communities, engage the families, making sure that we're providing trauma-informed care, really make sure that we have a well-trained workforce in terms of their skills and understanding of the impact of trauma, both on the young person and the families. Promote, and by the way, we also want to make sure that the workforce understands their own history of trauma and what things might trigger the workers themselves. That's really important for us to put tools in place for the workforce to support folk who might be triggered within the work. That we want to promote and support safe behavior in the home, schools, and communities, reduce the over-reliance on emergency departments, inpatient care, detention centers, And we want to assist youth and families in linking to supports and services that are really going to meet their needs at the time they need it for the duration that they need it. So these are all the goals of mobile response and stabilization. From a workforce perspective, today we're going to talk about the idea of recruitment. What kind of individuals do this work and do it well? Where do we find them? And how do we train them, make sure that they are credentialed in a way that makes sense, both from a workforce perspective, also from the skill development and who can do the work. We're going to talk about training, what some of the training components are, but we know that training by itself is not going to be the only tool that's necessary. We want to talk about some certification process in place so we know who's doing the work and we have some understanding of their commitment and skills, coaching, mentoring to that. And then the coaching and mentoring pieces, which sometimes get left off of conversations around workforce, are really important within this work because of the uniqueness of working with children, youth, and their families in their own homes, in their own communities, and the impacts of that experience for the workforce around their own trauma experience, their own need for skill development. All of those things are really important. We're going to determine the difference between coaching and mentoring. One is, coaching is really about, making sure that we're helping people through the current situation where they are and where they're going. And mentoring is this idea of long-term relationship in terms of where folks are going to land in the long term. So anyway, it's really good to talk about a lot of these ideas and concepts. And then when we talk about training, we want to make sure that we're discussing language, as we talked about, not just the languages individuals speak, but also the language of engagement, right? Making sure that folks are feeling like they're part of the process, right? So we want to make sure our language is clear, that folks can communicate with each other in a way that's meaningful, both the young people and families, but also the professionals themselves. Some terminology within the work within behavioral health systems have multiple meanings. And so we really need to get to clarity as quickly as possible. Bringing language to the most common place really is helpful in that work. We want to understand cultural, the culture that you're working with in communities, but we also want to understand how to understand culture within homes and the individual identity of young people when it is in contrast to their families. We want to understand some brain development, really important for us to understand what's happening for young people and what our expectation is for young people who have autism, as an example, or who are 10. And we want to understand trauma and trauma-informed care, the impact of trauma on the individuals who are providing care, as well as young people and their families, and then how the systems are organized and designed within particular communities to work together, and how we bring those systems together in a way that's meaningful. So that's a pretty big overview of what we're hoping to catch today. If you can, like I said, one more time, if you could, ask your questions in the chat, we're happy to take them. If you have any resources that you'd like to share, please share them. We would appreciate that. And having laid it all out for you, I'm going to hand to Hazelyn Pilgrim, who will walk us through the peer support conversation.
Well, good afternoon again. Well, it's afternoon here in New Jersey. As we were thinking about the role of peer support in children's mobile response, I was struck by the fact that it is an essential part of a continuum of care that begins very early on and goes all the way through post-intervention. And we think about the opportunity to engage families early when they first identify a need. We can see how, from our experience, it is important that families know where to go for help and get connected to resources in their local communities. And that's one of the values or benefits of having peer support at the very beginning of their journey within the children's system of care. In our experience, families that have that seem to do better because they begin to make connections with each other through support groups, through Warm Line, and through workshops, even before they reach the so-called deep end of the pool, which is when they are receiving full wraparound services through a care management organization. Next. So some of the benefits of peer support, obviously, as a person with lived experience, there's a difference when we speak to another parent or caregiver about what they might be experiencing and going through. We share our stories for the benefit of others, and it creates a level of trust. The sense that you get me is there oftentimes from the beginning. And then sometimes it takes a while because we may not be, although we have similar experiences, we may not be understanding their context, their culture, their values, their preferences. Give you an example. Just recently, we had a referral for a young woman who was born in the United States, being raised in the United States, and her mother simply said, this is just attention-seeking behavior. And the folks on the team were saying, well, how do we gain this caregiver's trust and engage her and get her to recognize that her child needs help? And we came to a place of understanding that perhaps leaning into some of the things that were important to her, like her vision for the future, the relationship she wanted to have with her daughter in the future. How might she see that working? And what are some of the things she might be willing to do today to get there, rather than challenging her beliefs about the origin of the problem. And so having a staff that understands that and can help navigate those conversations, those difficult conversations, is important. Peer support staff can definitely instill hope for a better future. The more your staff reflects the community served and an understanding of the different communities served, the more likely it is that they'll be able to connect with caregivers and youth in this way. Family partners, as we call them, provide engagement, help families make informed decisions, and help them navigate through the various systems. Oftentimes in our first interaction, families may not fully grasp all of the things that they're going to face. They may have a piece of the puzzle, but not be familiar with the other pieces. For example, they may be familiar with, I got here because the school kept calling. But then what is here? What is this system of care business? How did the juvenile justice system become involved? Who are these in-home people that are coming in, and all the confusion that goes with that? So peer support, even at the very beginning, can help to tease out who's on the team, who can be on the team, and to give the caregivers, help them develop a sense of control over their lives, that we're not taking away your parental rights or your decision-making authority. We're not challenging your value systems. We're here to support you in achieving your vision. Here are some things you may need to know. Here are some questions you may want to ask. But basically our role is to support the caregivers so that they are engaged actively and can make sound decisions for themselves. The principle of family voice and choice. Educate them with the information, give them opportunities to ask all kinds of questions, and be available. Be available. Use active listening, reflective listening. These are the things that we have found in our work with family partners to be the essential components of peer support. One of the other benefits is that we can continue the journey with the caregiver. So one-to-one peer support is not the end-all and be-all. Increasingly, we're looking at how do you better serve families by warm line, support groups, workshops, where they connect with other parents, and thereby reduces the reliance on that formal paid support person. Nothing brings me more joy than when I see two caregivers come to a workshop, or as we've had some cafes in the community, and they connect, and then I hear at the next meeting, oh, I talked to so-and-so. That's what it's about, for them to develop relationships with families and youth, to develop relationships within their own communities that are natural. That, I mean, how many of us have a team that we call every time we have a crisis, right? We call our family and friends and people that we know care about us. That's exactly what families say they need and want. And we can be facilitators of those kinds of connections. I think I've covered that point, assisting families to build a community of natural supports. Okay. On the subject of workforce development, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because it is challenging, as everyone knows in this time, to find and to recruit and retain employees to do this work, any part of the system of care. But it is especially true, I think, in peer support, where your lived experience is the very thing that qualifies you. And at the same time, you're supporting families that may look very similar to your own, and in some ways may reflect situations that you've been through. So there's this element of trauma, if you will, vicarious trauma in the work. So I find that we've had to really lean into more frequent conversations with the team about the peer support model, fidelity to the model, understanding when we enter and when we exit, that we're not a long-term resource, okay? Creating levels within the organization. So for example, we have family partners who do one-to-one face-to-face with families and youth. And then we have family liaisons who help with the warm line and the resource finding and the maintaining contact with families on an ongoing basis. And they work together as a team. We have found that we needed to do more work around ethics and boundaries in peer support, because that becomes really huge. I think about Liz and her language slide all the time, because when I hear my parents, my families, I get a little concerned, because they're not our parents or our families. They belong to each other, and we're here as formal paid support. And so having those conversations around boundaries and how that might be affecting your effectiveness in the work is something that we look at, and really giving the team tools to help address that. I have found that in talking with our team, giving them specific feedback around language. They will say to me, help me frame that, because I don't want to make them feel bad. I don't want them to stop contacting me, but I really need to have some space here. And so we will actually, role play. What might you say with this caregiver or with this youth? We've had one youth recently say, well, can I come to your house? To the youth peer support person. It's just like, no, but how do you say that in a way that says, I care about you, you're important to me, and these are the boundaries or the parameters of our relationship. I'll see you next Monday. I'm looking forward to seeing you next Monday, and mean it, because they'll be able to tell. We found that our staff needs a lot of training around trauma-informed care and what it really means, and we're still working through that. Thankfully, we have a lot of support from the Department of Children and Families here in New Jersey. It's a lot of excellent training on that, a lot of training around, regulation, emotional regulation, understanding your triggers, and so on. We have just begun, through our Zero Suicide initiative, training on suicide prevention. All staff will be trained in QPR, as will parents who have been identified as having a youth who is either at risk of or having attempted. And so we'll be learning together in a community about these things, which I think is a very important piece of developing the competencies that are necessary in the current climate. The next topic is really something that I give a lot of thought to, particularly as an immigrant and as a woman of color, the whole idea of cultural humility. I've often said that I feel very culturally incompetent, simply not because I don't have academic training and credentials or I haven't had exposure, but there's so many nuances to culture, right? And the moment you think you've gotten it figured out is the moment that you'll run into something that makes you say, I don't got it, and that's, so we find ourselves actually constantly being students and learning from the families. Tell me what's important to you. Tell me about your traditions, your background. and just being open to what they have to say. I often say to the team, you know, if you listen with your heart, get out of this, you'll be amazed by what people will share with you and how much insight you'll gain into their culture, their practices, their belief systems, issues like stigma, issues like, you know, I don't want anybody to know about this because I'm here illegally, you know, without documentation. And so understanding that there are all these different nuances to culture, not just language, race, ethnicity. Because, you know, we look at that and we say, oh, people may look at me and say, well, she is this, and put me in, you know, 2 or 3 buckets, when in reality, I may see myself in 6 buckets, some of which you've never thought about, or maybe not be able to see, because we look at what we see externally, but culture is really an inside job. So each individual has to define that. And it's part of our role, I think, to explore that so that we can be more effective in providing the support, education, and advocacy that we want to provide to youth and families. Intra and intercultural dynamics. Well, boy, I butt into that all the time, right? So there's the generational thing. My child, for example, is the first generation to be born in this country. However, he was raised with very traditional values from the old country, as we would say, or back home, as we say. And sometimes that becomes a bit of a rub, especially in adolescence, when, you know, the dominant culture says, this is what an adolescent does. This is how an adolescent dresses. This is how an adolescent behaves. And, you know, there's this disconnect that often happens. So even having those conversations with parents, I found it important. This is where I lean into a little bit of my story for the benefit of the other, and explaining that from the child's or the youth's perspective, they're dealing with a whole different reality than what we can understand. And the thing to do is, perhaps, without giving advice, but just giving examples, lean into what you want that relationship to be like in 5 years. And how do we get there? What are the steps we can take? What are the behaviors? What are the questions we can ask? Because if you simply take the approach of saying, this is what I know, this is how it's going to be, and there's no other option, that'll shut down the relationship pretty quickly. So understanding and training our workforce to look at these dynamics is important. And having people with lived experience from those cultures involved in the conversations, in the training, is important, rather than someone who, you know, you may have a PhD in a particular subject, but that may not be all that you need. Having those credible messengers, people from the community, that they can say, aha, that person, she speaks my language, whatever that language is. It may be English with a different accent, but you know that person, and you can say, she understands me, and that can make a difference. The last point I wanted to make is about caring for the workforce, because I think we have, especially in the last couple of years, we've seen the impact of having a workforce that is struggling with shortages, struggling with the demands of parenting and working at the same time. And so increasingly looking at ways to support the current workforce. One is the flexibility that they need. We're no longer in a 9-to-5, clock in, clock out kind of situation. Practices that address compassion fatigue. So for example, in our team, people get a subscription to Calm so that they can, you know, use that app to kind of decompress between visits. We used to say 5 visits a day. Like, well, 5 visits may not be realistic, even with telehealth. So pace yourself. If you know the intensity is going to be this, you know, you're dealing with a parent that has 3 kids, adjust your schedule. Make sure you're taking time in between to care for yourself. We introduced wellness recovery action plans for the team. I believe everybody should have one. I certainly do, and I check mine periodically and update it during times of high stress. And that's so that we know, and somebody around us knows, what's going on and can support us in the work. That is not the same as having a therapist. I believe in having one on speed dial, but that's a whole different thing. But together, these are a combination of strategies that can help the workforce to be healthy, avoid burnout, and to be sustainable. I think I want to start. Oh, one other thing. So recently we revisited the idea of providing someone who is not a supervisor and who's not the executive director to just have a space where peer support staff once a month can debrief with someone who is clinically trained in a group. So it's like peer support for the support workers. And we just reintroduced that. And the feedback from the team has been, this is so valuable. Thank you for doing it. Because they really they can't go to a regular support group and do that. And they really need that space. So those are some things that we think about. And lastly, career pathways. Every living thing grows. And people want growth opportunities. They want to know, if I stay here 5 years, what's it going to look like? What are the options for me? How can I grow? So we're looking at that and seeing how we can expand the roles in some ways, not necessarily hierarchical, but to expand the skill set, the opportunities, the exposure, and allow folks to grow in the work.
Thank you, Hazel. And before we hand to Sarah, there's at least one question in the chat I wanted to get to. And what is the app that you were talking about? Can you explain what the app is?
So Calm, C-A-L-M. It is a relaxation app.
Great.
And businesses can subscribe to it for their teams for relatively low cost. And we did it because a lot of people said they had difficulty at night just kind of relaxing, and so
yes.
We offered that.
That's
small
great.
investment.
It's a good app. I have that. There's two others I think that are really pretty interesting as well, but I didn't know that Calm actually provided for businesses. So that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we can visit this one right now too. Do you have a template for the wellness and recovery plan?
Actually, that comes from Mary Ellen Copeland's work.
Okay.
And the Wellness Recovery Action Plan. We use her framework,
okay.
And we actually complete that little portable plan that you can keep in your pocket or your purse. Mm-hmm.
So we can provide the resource for that. That would be great. I absolutely agree with you that that the workforce needs tools, and I always had my own action plan of things to take care of at work, at home, and the ride home. So when you hit the traffic, you're ready to go, right? All of those things are really important. Thank you. Thank you, Hazel. All right, Sarah. I think there's some more questions that are come up, but that was really helpful. All right, Sarah, I'm going to move your slides.
Thank you, Liz. All right. So I just wanted to start out by talking about what helps adults to learn and what it means to have high quality workforce development. So it is not as simple as just sort of throwing a training in front of people, having them attend and saying, okay, great, now you're ready to practice the MRSS model. We know that is not useful for adult learners, and that we really need to have a model that combines coaching, training, other workforce support to really help them be able to translate the learning. Workforce development in a high quality MRSS practice model needs to build practitioners' knowledge. So knowledge of the history, the theory, the philosophy, the rationale, like why are we doing this model in the first place, right? Adult learners really connect to sort of that why of why are we doing the work? How does it translate into our actual practice? That's really important. And then the understanding of the actual components of the MRSS, and then the demonstration of the practice elements. So they need behavioral rehearsal, they need to practice the skills, and then they need to get feedback on practicing those skills. So that can happen in the training session, but then that's going to continue on to that coaching support, which is why it's so important. And throughout that we're building on data. So we're actually understanding what is going well, what are we challenged with, and then sort of curating what we're doing to provide additional training and additional support on what we know is going well and going less well or is challenging us. We're really focused on how we can operationalize values. So how are we translating values into skills? And we're going to talk about this more when we sort of talk about who can be a part of the workforce, because we're saying lots of folks can be a part of the workforce. And the reason we're saying that is because we can translate these values into skills, and skills are teachable, right? And so there's lots we can do to help folks learn. We want to make sure that whatever curriculum we're building or that we're rolling out is based in, again, sort of those underlying values of system of care, of how mobile response and stabilization services came together in the first place, thinking about creating models that are trauma responsive, that do emphasize partnership with families, that do emphasize collaboration across systems, and making sure that we are practicing cultural humility and all of the things that my co-presenters have already sort of beautifully spoken about today. But all of that needs to be embedded sort of right deep into that curriculum. Like that is the core of that. And then how are we taking that and then again making those skills? So things that are helpful for adult learners, we already talked about practice. Also opportunities for them to actually track their growth. So if they can see how they're moving through learning, that's useful. We all like to be successful, right? Like we all like to grow and develop. And so being able to actually measure that is an amazing thing. I already mentioned sort of that relevance to role and mission. Like, how are we connecting this model, right? Like, because we want adherence to a model. Well, that sounds super fun, right? Like, how are we connecting adherence to a model with the things that are important to you as a human person doing service work, right? Like, you got into service work. There's something about that that matters to you. We need to connect back to that for adult learning to be successful. We need a supportive peer environment for adult learning to be successful, right? Like we need a place where it is safe to not know answers, to wonder about things, and to also be experts, right? Like we have to be safe both to be totally new to something and ask all the questions and try something that we don't know how to do yet. And also we need places that when we do have expertise, when we do bring our own lived experience or educational background or particular skill set, whatever it is, that we are given opportunities to shine and share that with our peers, because they don't want to just hear from that person on the front of the room or in the pinned Zoom box or whatever it might be here in 2022, right? They want to hear from each other as well, and they want to have those opportunities to both be learner and teacher. And then again, making sure that that support continues on. So I think we can probably move on to the next slide. So this just shows you a little bit about what we've come up with as a curriculum here at the Institute. And so some of the things that we think are important. So online learning modules that really help folks to be grounded in those system of care principles and to understand how mobile response and stabilization services is part of a larger modern system of care. So providing that foundation prior to attending an in-person training. And then also making sure that their organization or state or whoever it is that is making those decisions are sending them to some sort of certification for crisis de-escalation. We certainly get into crisis de-escalation a little bit in the practice, but we don't do a deep dive because we think it's really important that people have a separate certification for that and feel really grounded and secure in those training and tools. And then also making sure that folks are getting trained in whatever crisis assessment tool they're going to be using crisis assessment as a really important part. That assessment piece, right, is an important part of the work and practice. And so we want to make sure that people already understand how to use whatever tool has been selected. Certainly when you think about selecting a tool, I think it's important to think about a few things. First of all, you want to select a tool that is really about communication and really about helping the folks on that team to understand what are the needs, what are the supports and resources that already exist, right? What are the families, understanding what's going on, how are we really building that family story, essentially? Like that is more important than a tool that relies more heavily on diagnostic criteria or so forth. Like we really want to stay away from that for a couple of reasons. One, we're welcoming lots more folks in with mobile response and stabilization. Like not everyone is going to have a diagnosis, and that's okay. Everyone has a need, right? Everyone has a need and they are reaching out, and we want to provide them whatever help or support they need. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're pigeonholing them in someplace diagnostically, but also when we're thinking about workforce and we're thinking about the challenges that many of us face for workforce, we know that perhaps not everyone doing this work is going to be licensed or is going to be able to provide a diagnosis. And so there are lots of tools out there that exist that don't require any kind of licensure or particular educational level. What they require is that you're trained on the tool, you understand how to use it, perhaps you pass a certification to use the tool. So all of those things we like to have folks to have before they even come into the Zoom meeting or step into the live training. And then we have an introductory to practice training, which is really what I talked about on the last slide, like really how are we operationalizing mobile response. We also have a specific one that's just for access point staff who really don't need to go through all of the individual practice steps of mobile response and stabilization, but I'm very passionate about the idea that if we are not training access point staff, then who's going to get to the services, right? So it's really important that just across the continuum, we're thinking about workforce development and staff development, that we're not just training the folks who are going out to respond, or they won't have anything to respond to. And then individualized boosters. So this goes back to that idea that I mentioned on the last slide about being data informed in training. And so when we say we're data informed, it's not just that we're creating trainings that are based in evidence. Like, of course, that's very important, right? As we're training skills and as we're selecting the components that are part of our training, that we're selecting things that are based in evidence and that we know will have positive outcomes for children and families. And also we're using data to actually think about, like, what are the additional boosters that our staff need? If you see that your staff is doing awesome with engagement, like they get in there, families are really connecting with them, they feel the partnership, a lot of great work is being done in that way, but then they come back and you say, let me see the crisis plan. And they're like, well, like, I don't know, we talked about it, I wrote a few things down. You're like, well, there's no actual action steps in here. Like, what are we actually going to do? Right. So then you say, okay, I see that like 6 out of my 8 staff are really struggling with crisis planning. Like that's the booster we want to do then, right? We don't want to just throw them into training after training. We want to target the training that's helpful. We have limited hours in the day, limited capacity to pay attention. We really want to think about what's going to be helpful to folks. What are they asking for? And using tools, right? So this is another thing, like in our coaching, in our system and organizational support, we can actually use tools to track some of that. So we can hear from staff, like, yes, and we can see in documentation, maybe like where things are going better and where things are a little bit harder, but we can also actually use some tools to track and see where we're having better adherence to the model and where we're maybe falling a little short, and try and figure out what the reason is for that and what kind of support or skill building might be helpful to close that gap. All right, next slide, please. So these are just some ideas of roles that are helpful within your mobile response and stabilization workforce. Certainly there may be others that you may be thinking of, but at a minimum, of course, you need that frontline staff who's going to provide the direct care and who's going to go out on mobile responses and provide the stabilization work. You want a licensed supervisor or, whoever in your jurisdiction is allowed to practice psychotherapy, essentially. So you do want someone within the chain of command who can provide support to that direct care staff, whether that's by phone, maybe occasionally popping in telehealth while they're on site, or in some cases actually coming out to respond for more complex or challenging situations. And then having psychiatric consultation is also helpful. And often there are ways that you can really leverage resources for that. We certainly don't think that every single person's going to have a psychiatrist on their staff, but how are we leveraging the resources that already exist in our community or our region using telehealth and other innovations to make sure that we do have that available to us. And then certainly when you're thinking about systems that are data informed, and that are continually offering workforce development, do you need someone who's actually managing those things? If those things are assigned to the supervisor, is that also the person who's on call 24/7 and also the person who is responding when there's a complex situation? Like, what is the capacity of one person to do all of those things? So it's just something to consider. Let me go to the next slide. And so who can do this work, right? Like this is the $1 million question here in a time when we're all trying to figure out how we can fill vacant roles and how we can actually get enough staff to meet the volume of the needs within our communities. And we know that we want our teams to be available 24/7, 365, right? So we have to find people who are not only good at this work, but are willing to work weekends and are willing to work evenings. And are willing to go and meet folks in homes and communities, right? So who are these folks? Where do they exist? And there are lots of them, I promise. And I think one of the things that we need to do is really expand how we're thinking about it. So we talked earlier about expanding beyond just thinking of clinicians, licensed folks, master's level people doing this work. Certainly they can be part of your staffing pattern, and they do need, and again, you do need to have them within your team, but they don't necessarily have to be the folks doing the day-to-day work. That we can also employ bachelor's level human service professionals. And we want to think about the use of peers. And we want to think about, right, so I think we can think about connecting families to family support organizations, family-led organizations, but also we can actually have peers on our response teams. Because we know that personal traits and trainings are a lot more important than the degree attained. And I want to just reiterate a few things that were already said, but that I think are really important. Peers are such an important part of this workforce and really provide opportunities for us not only to increase our staffing capacity, but of course, increase the service level that we can offer to families, right? By involving those folks with lived experience. But once we do that, we're also understanding, or we need to understand, that we are then obligated to build support into our organizations, right? We can't just hire on peers and then hope for the best. We have to be creating those places and spaces for them to continue to meet their own needs, the needs of their children, to have those career paths, like was already mentioned, right? We don't necessarily only want to have peers on direct care. We want to think about how are we building them throughout our organization so that they can see, not only have areas for growth, but so that they also have voice and impact at various levels within our organization, so that we're not just administrating to peers about them without involving them in conversations, right? So all of those things are super important. And of course, they're important for peers, but really when you're thinking about crisis workforce, it's important for everyone. Like Liz said, whether we identify ourselves as a peer or we're just someone doing this work, chances are that there is a reason we went into this work. We have our own things that are going on. And if we're not taking care of ourselves, and if we're not provided spaces to take care of ourselves, we're not going to last. And we're not going to provide great service to the children and families who need them. So I think that is all from me for now. So thanks for the opportunity to share some of that.
So Sarah, what I hear you saying is that we need a workforce who believes it can and should be done. Yeah. That is the #1 requirement in our hiring. And that really the translation of the skill development, the values into skills and the skills into training is the work that we can do once we actually hire folks who believe it can and should be done. Right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Liz, that it's really about finding those people who are interested in the work, who are excited by the work, who care about not just children and families, but partnering with them, right? Care about lifting their voices to the front. So absolutely, all of those things. The skills can be taught.
Thank you. And you help actually pique the interest around the psychiatric consultation, because we're going to have a conversation about that in January. So I'm going to pull these slides down so we can actually have a conversation about all the things that we just talked about. For folks who are joining us for the first time, which you should know that this is the portion of our program where we like to hear any questions that come up or, innovations that you have. And I know that right now we have at least one question in the chat I want to get to for you, Sarah, and that is, we have a comment first that pinpointing the training needs for individuals and overall staff makes sense. We can sometimes get prescriptive in our ideas of training needs. Are there tools that can help supervisors tick off mobile response and stabilization components to assess for so they know what to look for?
Yeah, so at the Institute, we are, we have developed tools, and so they're not necessarily generally available, but certainly if folks are interested in learning more about that or partnering with us around any curriculum or workforce building, they can reach out to me and we'd be happy to talk about how we can provide that support. But I think, more generally, just really tapping into the trends within your work. So I think, are you doing, regular reviews of documentation, not just like, is it done? Does it have these components? But are you sort of on the aggregate looking across your staff and understanding areas of strength and areas of challenge? Because those would be the kinds of things that I would target.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think, one of the things that, at least from my experience, is important for the workforce is as we're paying attention, we're also paying attention when folks are really in their, in their groove and doing well. And when there's challenges, maybe that, their workload feels overwhelming, or there's a new skill that they have to face or, be challenged with, and the idea of the coaching piece, right? So we want to talk about the supervision, which is really important. And the supervision is about, making sure that people have the tools in their tool belt to get the job done. That includes the documentation and the actual training and all of those components. But look, if we could help folks in this discussion understand the difference between supervision, coaching, and mentoring, I think that might be helpful. So let's start with supervision as you see it, Sarah.
Sure. So I think that, with supervision in the crisis sphere, you have kind of multiple hats that you're wearing, right? So the first is really, I think, safety. For me with crisis, I think sort of being that safety checkpoint is really important. So when our teams are actually responding and out there and doing their work, sort of being that backstop for safety. But then, beyond that kind of daily basic tasks, of course, you have your administrative role. We all know what that is.
Yeah.
But then you have this role as sort of a skill building person. And so one of the things that we like to talk about is that we have spent a lot of time in supervision traditionally, right? Talking a lot about families and how families are in service.
Mhm.
And what we want to do instead is talk about ourselves and how we are in services with families, right? And so really flipping that on its head and thinking about how am I pulling out? And this sort of gets back to that earlier question too about like, how are you targeting training and all these things? Like really being, do you know what the skills are that your folks need in order to be successful? Do you know what they look like? Can you, when they're talking about their work, can you identify where there's a skill or where there's a skill deficit? And
Mhm.
then can you help them to practice that skill in a new way?
Mhm.
And so really using actual tools in your supervision to clearly lay out to them, like, here's the skill I want you to practice. Here's some ways you can practice it. Here's some resources that you can hop on to, your coworker so-and-so is amazing at this skill. Why don't you go talk to them or go out on a visit with them and see how they do it, right? And so I think as a supervisor, it's really about that, helping our staff in their direct work to grow as mobile response and stabilization workers. And then of course, sort of, going back to what I said, that last little piece is just being a safe place, right? Like we need safe spaces to land. We need places where we can decompress, where we can share, where we can, whatever it is, and whether that's the supervisor or the supervisor creating that for the person, I do think that's an important task as well.
Yeah, two things I want to just point out. One is it's important to have safe space, right? That space where folks come back to is not just space that you can decompress, right? But also space that allows for the work to get done. It is safe for folks to be able to, know that they're supported, that if mistakes are made, that those mistakes are corrected through learning. And in learning organizations, we always work to grow, right? Also, I just wanted to point out that we have the perfect question in the chat to take us to the next place, and that is any specific recommendations on the training for supervisors. Both, Sarah and Hazelyn, please feel free to share so that folks can learn.
So one of the recommendations I would have around training supervisors is to utilize families with lived experience who've actually, not had lived experience generally, but specifically with mobile response. I think that there's a great power in hearing how families experience a service, what it felt like to them to receive that service, what they might have been thinking and feeling when they initiated the call for help. And that can inform how we then engage with families in the future. So I definitely subscribe to the notion of utilizing even video presentations to have, supervisors and all staff really to understand the family from an emotional standpoint, what it means to call for help and what the expectations are at that time.
Right. I mean, just that idea of picking up the phone and asking for help is huge, the moment that you get that part of how huge that is. And they called us, and so we need to respond is just so important in the work of the, of helping the workforce understand that particular piece. So I think that's a really good point, Hazelyn, around, the training for the workforce. It also helps us, right, when we understand that piece, that we also understand why it's so important that we just go, right? That we don't go, oh, sorry, yeah, we can help you, right? When someone becomes that vulnerable to pick up the phone and ask for help, that we address that vulnerability, that sense of urgency with an equal sense of urgency from the system, right? The system responds in a way that makes sense. And if we can't do that, I think it's important for us to think about, how do we move our system to be able to do that? I also wanted to just make one particular point, and Hazelyn, is such a good point to include families in, but for some folks who are listening in today, they don't have mobile families yet, right? Because they're still in the process of building. So I think it's important to remember that a system of care value is to include parents in the building of, right?
Absolutely.
That actual upfront work. I think both Hazel and I would agree that New Jersey's system is so powerful because it was built by families at the policy table who said, this is why we think this needs to happen, right? At the learning table of what the experience was for families, even though we didn't have mobile yet, they were helping us understand those particular things. So remembering that system of care value is so important. And while we're talking about system of care, I also just wanted to make that point that mobile response and stabilization is not a certain, a siloed outside of system of care, right? It is the beginning part for families in their experience, for many families within the system of care experience. So it's just really important for us to remember that all the grounding values and principles of system of care are the ones that drive the work in mobile. Okay, so Sarah, your turn.
So, I mean, I think when you're thinking about training supervisors, the first thing is to remember that most folks who could become supervisors are promoted not because they are good supervisors, but because they're excellent at their work, right? So you have folks who are really great, maybe at mobile response and stabilization care, and then they get promoted into supervisor because maybe they're awesome with engaging families and their paperwork is like chef's kiss and like we're all really right into it. But we haven't actually helped them to think about what it means to be a supervisor. But the good news is, again, that it's skills, right? So it's really just a parallel process between we learn skills to be really good at engaging families. We learn skills to be really good at de-escalating crisis. And similarly, we learn skills to be a good supervisor. So, good supervisory trainings really do focus on what are those skills that help you to be a good supervisor. How are you helping folks to, understand their own learning and processes? You're not a professional advice giver, right? Like you're not coming to them with every solution. You're helping them to uncover their own solutions, to invest in their own skill building and so forth. And so when you're thinking about supervisory training, those are the kind of things I would want to focus in on.
Yeah, I think that all those are great points. And the idea of lifelong learning, right? You're beginning a process in which I think for all of our workforce, they're beginning a process of lifelong learning as they, and we want to be able to continuously provide tools around that, right? Ideas and thoughts. And, I think you mentioned this, Sarah, like the idea of just doing a brown bag lunch where folks sit and talk about stuff, doing book clubs, where, folks are talking about what they're reading. These are ideas that were really powerful in some of the work that we did in creating learning organization, even at the Department of Children and Families, where folks were feeling very comfortable in the learning process. So really important parts. Before we go any further, we have a question in the chat I do think we should get to, and that is the idea of what happens with youth peer support and how does this operate within the world of mobile response and stabilization. And before we begin this conversation, I just want to say, like, this is new, right? This is the cutting edge of mobile response and stabilization. So we don't have a lot of examples to pull from. We have a lot of states that are thinking about how to do this and how to do it well, and they're building certification process for their youth and peer support. And there are some states that we're keeping an eye on how they do it, because it's really important, their process that they're going through and how they're beginning to think through. And the couple of examples are states that are really have a sort of a dual process of certification for that peer support piece, as well as to be that mobile response, a team member, right? So they're doing both. We have examples for the call center, by the way, and so there's some really great work that's happening around peers being part of the 988 work and part of the call center work. So there's a few different examples we can pull from. But as we think about it for the future, so Hazelyn, I'm just going to throw it to you to see if you have any thoughts right off the bat around what folks should be thinking about when it comes to peer support, when it comes to youth peer support moving forward.
Well, certainly one key factor would be the readiness, stage of readiness that the individuals present with. And we were thinking about this just the other day, and how can we do a better job of really assessing, I hate that term, where somebody is in terms of their ability to really commit to do the work. They may have passion, they may have knowledge, interest, and skills, but in terms of life circumstances, they may not be ready. So how do we address that hurdle? And I don't have answers, so I'm eager to have conversation around it, because it's something we're thinking about, and it certainly is important. For us, a key factor is really having that open, courageous conversation without breaking any laws about how do you take care of yourself? Do you have a team?
Right.
And if the answer is no, I just go to the gym once a week or whatever, then that's a whole nother conversation.
I think one of the things you talked about earlier, Hazelyn, was really important, and that is that you've already built in tools into your work, right? With your whole team currently around wellness, plans, and making sure that folks are taking care of themselves, creating safe space, making sure that folks have those tools on understanding about burnout and about vicarious trauma. So those things are really important. And then I know that there's a lot of work in a lot of states around the trauma in the workforce that folks are bringing to the work, right? It's not even the work, they're bringing it.
They're already coming with it.
That's right. And so, and helping folks understand what their own experiences have to do and how they trigger. And so I think, keeping all of those things in mind as you're really thinking through this. What I will say to folks who are interested in this topic is that we are continuing to learn and to grow around the idea of true youth peer support as part of the mobile response and stabilization team that goes out. And we're really interested in hearing from folks who are interested in that particular topic. So please feel free to reach out and let us know. And as we're building resources, we're going to be happy to share them. There was another question in the chat I just want to get to, because I think it's an important one, and that is when we're talking about individuals who are 18 to 25 and they are asking for their family not to be engaged, how do we do that work, right? And I think let's just set the stage for that, and that is even individuals under the age of 18 sometimes don't want their families at the table. And we should be clear about, we should understand when and how and why that works and what works and doesn't work around that. But there is part of I think, the work around training of the workforce and helping the workforce prepare. We need to help have the workforce have the skills necessary to help young people work through that, right? To get to the other side. So can the service be provided for an 18 to 25-year-old? Yes, that's not a debatable point. I think the debatable point is, what skills do the workforce bring to the table around helping that young person reconnect when possible? Try to understand what is driving the decision-making around not having the, family at the table. What are the things that we could do around engagement of maybe not the biological family, maybe it is the identified family of this young person. And if that doesn't exist, how do we actually begin building some tools for that young person to build a natural support network around them? So, but that's my comment. Hazelyn, I'm going to give you some space on that.
So I would agree with all that you said, Liz. In addition, I think that training the teams on tools like motivational interviewing and how it relates to this work can be incredibly valuable. And not just training, but I think, Sarah, you mentioned that there are levels of this in adult learning, right? So the practicing the skill, the actual coaching, and then pulling back and observing them doing it and giving feedback, I think, is a powerful way to embed the skills in the workforce that are needed to effectively have these conversations so that folks, look, I believe most people want to get better. They want to do better. They want a good life, however they define that. And I think there's an openness to things, but we must have the tools and the skills to be able to engage in those conversations. And I think MI may be one of those things that we could use more of.
Yeah, so I don't disagree. I mean, it does get back to that conversation, even in the language where we talk about motivation, right? And individuals being not motivated or resistant, right? Resistance is a word I only use in these conversations, not that it relates to individuals that are, part of the work. So I think it's important that the workforce comes skilled with, the ability to have courageous conversations, right? And so I think you're absolutely right. Sarah, I was curious because I'm sure that you had some thoughts about that.
Liz, I think, a lot of my thoughts are very similar to what you already shared, of just that I would really want to understand where that young person is coming from, what is the contributing factor to them not having a relationship. And then once we can kind of understand what those contributing factors are, then we can start determining whether we can repair those relationships or need to build new ones, right? And that's driven by the young person and moving at their pace. But I do think that we don't just, like they say, I don't talk to my mom and dad, we just say, okay, right? So I think it's, again, whatever, just reiterating what everyone said, courageous conversations and understanding what's happening so we know where to go next.
Yeah, I was just thinking about a nickel for every time I heard that in my career. And sat and had conversations. I think it comes up all the time, right? When you work with young people, whether they're under 18 or 18 to 25, it's complicated with 18 to 25 because you begin the work with, just really operating from that perspective. It's also complicated in the under 18 population of young people because parents can begin to drive some of the work first. And so how do we sequence, right, when other interventions come into place, when the request for assistance comes from the parent or the caregiver, and the young person themselves might not be ready for that. And that, also we need to think about in this conversation, I think is also important, how young people may or may not identify the same way as their parent does in terms of their culture, their race, their identity, right? So I'll tell you a quick story. We had some data challenges in one of the counties that I worked in the detention center because parents identified their child as one race and the child identified themselves as a different race. And so the data didn't work, right? And we had to put in the data dictionary that it's the young person's own definition of their race and their culture that we were going to accept. And that allowed us to begin the conversation of how the parents saw the child versus how that young person saw themselves.
Yeah. And Liz, this conversation really brings up another sort of workforce hiring point, is that as you're sort of doing those screenings and you're trying to figure out, oh, is this a person who's really interested in this work? Is this a person who has an affinity towards this work? Be conscious of that person who says, I love kids, I love children. That is a great thing, but you need to love families, right?
Yes.
Because if we find ourselves aligning too closely with one member of the family group, we really are challenged in this work. And so I think that's an important thing, is that, it takes a particular skill set to understand how to build alliance with multiple members of the same family, and to really be able to partner with all of them in effective ways, while sort of holding each of their stories true and valid and sacred and all of those things, like they all are, right? And also we can't kind of drift into just one viewpoint.
Well, you made Denise Davis very happy because she just said yes in the chat. And I think that's absolutely right. And it's complicated, right, to be able to hold those, understandings about what's happening for young people and their families. But our job is to bridge them, right? Our job is to hear them and help, sort of bridge the divide for some folks. But Hazelyn, I know you had something to say. Oh, you're on
I was
mute.
thinking about, viewing families as a system with their own
Yes.
ecology, and how important it is to really maybe take a look at that and have conversations with them around that in everyday language, because I think once we are able to better learn from families, we can better serve them.
Yeah, that's so true. It's really true. It is, at least in my experience, and I'm sure in your experience as well, it is from youth and families that we build innovations, that we learn what those innovations should look like. So we can think all the great things in the world around systems organization and design, and I've had 1,000 ideas about how that should look until I sit at the table with families who go, yeah, not so much, right? And so, yeah, that was a good idea. But yeah, no, and let me tell you why, or where the challenge is in that. And that's really helpful just to, just not just in the systems design, but in the family, right? In what's working and where people need help. Look, help is only helpful if it's useful to the people who ask for it, right? And so. Okay, we have another comment. What strategies are being used in communities that utilize peers outside of family or peer organizations, right? Peers connected to other peers in the workforce. So in other words, I think the question is, when you have individuals who are working not in the ability to connect with each other, like how do we create opportunities for peers to connect to each other, to have opportunities to share and grow and train. I'm just going to share one quick idea with folks, and then happy to open the floor. But and I'm wondering actually if anyone listening has any thoughts on this or experience around this as well. But one thought is that we create learning opportunities within the work, right? So, create specialized training, so you give folks an opportunity to come together. And I'll give you a quick example of what I mean. We've done this in multiple ways in New Jersey. We call them super user groups, where we actually bring people together to become really good at a particular thing. Mostly we've used that around the child and adolescent needs and strength tool, so that folks could learn and innovate on how to use the tool, or working with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and bringing in new skills. But creating a place in which folks can share ideas and challenges along the way can be really helpful, not just in working with peers or young people, but in building mobile response, right? In doing the, building tools around mobile, around what would work. We had multiple super user groups around some of this work early on. So just a thought for folks. Sarah, just wondering what your thoughts are.
I think one of the things I mentioned earlier that I think is pretty important is that you don't want to just hire one peer into your organization. Like, that's not a great hiring practice. So you do want to be thinking about how you're not, tokenizing people, how you're really using peers within your workforce in a way that's both meaningful to the families, but also create spaces where the peers can be successful. So having multiple peers at the direct care level, but then also building peers into your supervisory structure, your administrative levels, all the way up, so that they see and feel representation throughout the organization.
Hazelyn, anything you wanted to add?
100%.
Okay,
I certainly agree with that. Nothing to add.
Well, I have a couple of other things. As the two of you were talking, there were a couple of points, highlights I wanted to just reiterate for folks. One of them, which I just loved, was when Hazelyn said culture is an inside job. I just wanted to make sure that we got it back on so no one missed that. There's a really good way of thinking that really we have to take care of ourselves and understand where we're coming from, and that the idea of sitting with families to hear and where families are coming from is just really important. So I love that culture is an inside job, and I'm going to use that again. So if you wanted to add anything else to that, that'd be great.
Just that I think one of the core values that some of us and folks that have grown up in children's system of care and in other advocacy movements have embraced is that, you know, we define ourselves. We're not necessarily defined by our external circumstances or characteristics. We define ourselves. And I think that that's an aspect of self-determination, and which is fundamental for every human. And so culture is very much something that individuals get to decide how they view themselves, how they express that identity. And at times it may be different with different audiences and different circumstances, but always the individual has that right to define for themselves rather than being defined.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, I think, gets back to this idea of the workforce, right? The building of the skills of the workforce is to understand that the young people themselves, parents, you know, caregivers, all come to the table with that right, to define themselves. And then how we continue to do the work within that, and, you know, within the family is important that we come from that place in which we don't define that for, right? Sarah, you, I just want to reiterate, because this is workforce development, and I want to make sure that we spend a minute just highlighting what I thought was really brilliant as well, that we can translate values, those systemic care values, which are really important, into skills. And because we can translate them into skills, we can teach them, right? We can teach skills. So I just want to give you a minute just to highlight that too, because I wanted to make sure that we got that one back out there too.
Yeah, so this is really the idea that we can expand our workforce, that we can focus on bringing those people into the work who have natural aptitude and inclination for partnership work, for community-based work. You know, when I think about hiring for this work, I really do first think about those sort of attributes that are less teachable. How are we bringing in folks who aren't really stuck on schedules, right? We need folks who are flexible, who have some level of daring, adventurousness, right? Who thrive in situations where they have to be able to make decisions in real time and keep themselves grounded in challenging situations. Some of that can be taught, but a lot of that is more of a sort of a personal inclination. Like, certainly we can teach de-escalation skills and all that. I don't mean to say that we can't teach people how to help in challenging situations, because we can, but we can't make them like it.
That's right.
Right? So you want to look for people who first enjoy that, and then you can teach them the good skills on top of it.
Yeah, I think that's so incredibly important. And I've thought about that through the years. I happen to be one of those people who loves that adventure, right? That comes with being in the middle of the crisis situation and thinking that I can bring calm to crisis, right? Thinking that, your skill set can be helpful. But I think that now from an organizational or systems perspective, but I thought that early on in that idea of walking into a family's home and being helpful in just bringing calm to that, right? And staying calm. But there is an adventurousness around, working at night, right? There's adventurousness and how do you build your life around that idea, right? Of, working, not 9 to 5 kind of hours, and what that looks like are really important. So Malia says, yes, how can we find people who enjoy the adventure of crisis? I think we have to go find them, right? And the way that we go find them is a couple-fold that I just want to touch on in our last couple of minutes. And that is, we really want to have true relationships, first of all, I think with all of the universities in our communities, a lot of folks at that level. I remember when I was in college, my mother said, this is the only time in your life you'll be able to do this work, right? Of course, I did it for a very long time after that, but it's, we're at that place where we're thinking adventure is good. And so that's one place we want to begin. We want to actually engage the young people who are already in, using these services, and get them to think that they can be those workers of the future in the peer world, but from the peer world into the professional world, right? We want to be able to build our relationships within the communities in ways that are really meaningful. That's I'm going to give both Hazelyn and Sarah a couple minutes just to give their thoughts. So Hazelyn, you're up first.
I think a way that we've been trying to do this is to work closely with area colleges and universities. We recently began a conversation with a community college because we realized a lot of people who may not have gone to college straight out of high school, that may be a starting place. It's a great place to introduce our services, both as a support to families that are dealing with raising a child who may have some of the needs that we talk about, but it's also a place where we might identify individuals who would say, hey, that's something I didn't even know existed.
That's
That's
right.
a career path I could see getting involved with. So we see that's an opportunity. We take graduate students from the different programs in our area. And of course, what comes along with that is the opportunity to speak to classes from time to time. And therein we identify potential allies and potential workers for the future.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, so I think my co-panelists here have already really well highlighted the need for us to get people in who are studying for helping professions the information that this career pathway exists, because many of them don't know it. But beyond that, within our hiring practices, there are things that we can do during interview processes to identify folks who have these skills. And I know we have a lot of time, so I won't get a huge amount of detail, but you don't want to just ask questions. You want to bring skill questions into your interviewing process, and you also want to use actual practice. So the more you can use role plays within your interview processes, if your organization allows for it, can people do a shadowing exercise? So there are ways that sort of during that hiring process, you can start to see, target your questions and your exercises to see whether people possess some of these traits.
All good points. Good points. I'm just going to make one more comment and then we're going to wrap up. And that is when you get someone who's really adventurous, tell them to bring their friends. Tell them to, invite their friends to the table. Because if they bring their friends, they're more likely to stay. I know I brought a lot of friends with me because I was brought along by a friend. So it all works that way. And that those, professional relationships, by the way, tend to go on for a long time. People feel supported and grounded. So anyway, I want to thank you all for joining us today, what I think was a pretty robust conversation on workforce development. I'm very grateful that Sarah Quinn agreed to join us today and that Hazelyn continues to join in all of these monthly conversations. We hope you join next month, where our focus will be on geographical challenges around implementation of mobile response and stabilization. Thank you again for your time.